The topics I am going to discuss are CSS Introduction, CSS Reset, CSS and XSS, and a few very important questions and answers. Cascading style sheets is referred to as CSS. The way that HTML elements should appear on a screen, on paper, or in other media is specified by CSS. Much work is saved by CSS. It has simultaneous control over several web pages layouts. CSS files contain external style sheets. A declaration block and a selector make up a CSS rule. CSS syntax. The HTML element you wish to style is indicated by the selector. One or more declarations are contained in the declaration block and are divided by semicolons. A colon separates the name of the CSS property from its value in each declaration. Semicolons are used to divide CSS declarations, and curly braces are used to enclose declaration blocks. A style sheet language called cascading style sheets is used to specify how a document written in a markup language, like HTML or XML, will be presented and styled. Along with HTML and JavaScript, CSS is a fundamental component of the World Wide Web. Have a look at below example. All of the anchor elements in this example will have green text and be center-aligned. CSS selectors. To find or select the HTML elements you wish to style, use CSS selectors. 5 categories can be used to group CSS selectors. Basic selectors, which choose items according to their name, ID, or class. Combinator selectors, which choose elements according to a particular connection between them. Pseudo-class selectors, which choose elements according to a particular state. Selectors for pseudo-elements, choose and style a portion of an element. Attribute selectors, which allow elements to be chosen according to an attribute or its value. One of important concept in CSS is reset for consistency. The purpose of a CSS reset and accomplishment. A reset CSS is a collection of styles that are applied to HTML elements to make their default appearance consistent across various web browsers. It is also sometimes referred to as a CSS reset or reset style sheet. Resetting CSS aims to lessen browser-specific inconsistencies in default styling, which will facilitate web developers in creating a dependable and consistent layout for their websites. For HTML elements, such as margins, padding, font sizes, and other properties, web browsers have their own default styles. However, different browsers may have different default styles, which could result in uneven web page rendering. The goal of a reset CSS is to reset or neutralize these default styles, giving programmers a blank canvas on which to create, normalizing font sizes, eliminating any default list styles, and setting margins and padding to 0 are common features of a reset CSS. This way, developers don't have to worry about unexpected variations brought on by default browser styles. They can apply their own styles on top of a consistent baseline. Resetting CSS can be useful for getting a consistent starting point, but it's not always required for every project. In order to maintain useful default styles and still achieve cross-browser consistency, some developers would rather use a normalized CSS instead. In conclusion, by neutralizing the default styles applied by various browsers, a reset CSS helps to establish a consistent and predictable foundation for styling web pages. Now we discuss about CSS and XSS. CSS, XSS attacks. Cascading style sheets and cross-site scripting both address different aspects of web security and security-related concepts in the development of websites. Cascading style sheets. A document written in HTML or XML can have its presentation described using a styling language called CSS. It manages a web page's design, including the fonts, colors, and arrangement. Although CSS does not pose a security risk in and of itself, there may be issues with its implementation. CSS-related security considerations. Injection attacks. Injection attacks may result from the direct insertion of user input into CSS code without sufficient validation or sanitization. For instance, if a website lets users add CSS customizations to their profile pages without properly validating or sanitizing the input, a malevolent user could insert malicious code that modifies the overall appearance or layout of the website. Now we talk about cross-site scripting excesses. One kind of security flaw known as cross-site scripting (XSS) arises when an online application permits malicious scripts to be injected into pages that are viewed by other users. Numerous possible exploits could result from these scripts being run in the victim's browser. Types of XSS attacks. Stored XSS. Anytime a user accesses a particular page, the malicious script is loaded from the target server and remains there indefinitely. Reflected XSS. The malicious script that is incorporated into the URL only becomes visible when the victim clicks on a specially created link. The script is not stored permanently on the intended server. DOM-based XSS. To achieve its goals, the malicious script modifies the web page's document object model, DOM, which leads to an attack. Now we talk about how to prevent XSS attacks. Input validation and sanitization. Verify and sanitize user inputs to ensure they are free of malicious scripts. Output encoding. Encode user inputs to prevent them from being read as executable scripts before displaying them on websites. Content Security Policy (CSP). Cross-site scripting attack risks can be decreased by establishing a content security policy that specifies approved content sources. HTTP-only and secure cookies. Use the HTTP-only flag for cookies to prevent access to them by client-side scripts. Additionally, use the secure flag to ensure that cookies are only sent over encrypted connections. Web developers should be aware of these security considerations and follow best practices to protect against XSS attacks and other security-related issues. I will now go over some crucial CSS questions and their responses. Here are some commonly asked questions and their corresponding answers for cascading style sheets. What is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It's a language for style sheets that describes how a document written in HTML or XML is presented, including the arrangement, color scheme, font choice, and other visual components. How can I add CSS to a document that is HTML? Using the link element in the head section of the document or inline styles with the style element in the head section, you can include CSS in an HTML document. What makes inline, internal, and external CSS different from one another? Using the style attribute, inline CSS is applied directly to an HTML element. Internal CSS is defined in the style element within the HTML document's head. Using the link element, external CSS is linked to the HTML document and defined in a different CSS file. What does the CSS box model mean? The way CSS structures elements is explained by the box model. It is made up of the margin, padding, border, and content area. The size and spacing of an element within a layout are influenced by these factors. In CSS, how do I choose an HTML element? Selectors such as element selectors, class selectors, example .className ID selectors, example #idname, descendant selectors, and more can be used in CSS to select HTML elements. Why are cascading style sheets called cascading? When multiple CSS rules target the same element, the order of importance and specificity is referred to as cascading. Depending on how specific they are and what order they are defined in, CSS rules can override or cascade over one another. What distinguishes padding in CSS from margin? The space between an element's content and its border is known as padding, whereas the space outside an element's border that distinguishes it from other elements is known as margin. In CSS, how can I center an element both vertically and horizontally? For block-level elements, you can use margin, zero auto to center an element horizontally. An element can be centered both vertically and horizontally by using methods like CSS grid or flexbox. What do CSS frameworks do, and how do they come about? Pre-written collections of CSS and occasionally JavaScript that serve as a basis for web development are called CSS frameworks. They are employed in web page styling to save time and preserve consistency. How can I use CSS to make a website responsive? Using media queries, you can make a website responsive by changing the styling and layout according to the screen size of the device. Additionally, you can work with flexible units such as relative measurements and percentages. What is the CSS property box sizing? The method used to determine an element's width and height is specified by the box sizing property. By setting it to border box, more consistent layouts are ensured by including padding and border in the element's total width and height. How can I override a third-party style sheet or library's CSS styles? Make sure your styles load after the third-party styles in order to override them. You can do this by redefining the styles in your own CSS file, using more specific selectors, or using the important declaration. What is the purpose of the CSS ZIndex property? The arranged elements stacking order is managed by the ZIndex property. Higher ZIndex elements are displayed ahead of lower valued elements. What are SAS and less style CSS preprocessors? Scripting languages called CSS preprocessors allow CSS to do more. They make CSS generation more efficient and maintainable by enabling you to use variables, functions, and other resources. How can I use CSS to animate elements? Transitions, the animation property, and keyframes can all be used to create CSS animations. Animations can be defined for a variety of properties, including transform and opacity. These are only a few common questions regarding CSS. As web development advances, there is always more to learn about the vast topic of CSS.